so great to have all of our presenters here, and just going to introduce the context of the work that Elizabeth and I have been doing that led to this book. We began studying questions of affect and social media in 2016, prompted in particular by the surprise of the Trump election and Brexit. In 2017, we received a SHRP Knowledge Synthesis Grant to conduct preliminary research on the politics of emotion in the context of the post-truth discourse that was emerging at the time. We then received a SHRP Connections grant to hold a symposium, and in June 2019 brought together an international group of scholars for an intimate 3-day gathering to explore interdisciplinary approaches to understanding the weaponization of emotion in digital media. Following Brexit and the 2016 US election, we had begun tracking how news media were reporting on emotionality in politics and the myriad ways in which emotion was being weaponized and exploited in digital and social media. Indeed, this emotionality was recognized by the skyrocketing use of the very problematic term post-truth, named as Oxford Dictionary's Word of the Year in 2016, which was defined as, quote, relating to or denoting circumstances in which objective facts are less influential in shaping public opinion than are appeals to emotion and personal belief. The buzz around the term post-truth was one of the first flashpoints in public awareness of what we see as the sea changes in social media and the overall news media environment. One of the many problems with the notion of post-truth is that it seemed to propose that the presence of emotion itself is either new in politics or that there is somehow more of it now. Yet even though the idea of post-truth may in the end provide greater misdirection than accurate description, it does point us towards the question of how the distribution of information and affect are tightly linked. So a key aim of our collection is to call attention to the degree to which attention economies are, in fact, affective economies.
So while the post-truth buzzword and related reporting have often brought attention to emotion in public discourse, we notice that emotion was and is often couched in depoliticizing and or generic terms that fail to capture the politics of emotion. In this book, we've sought to illustrate the degree to which the political significance of public emotionality always depends on who's expressing it, the target toward which emotion is expressed, and the legitimacy granted or not to those expressing different emotions. The problem of pervasive disinformation is so extensive at this point, it's not an exaggeration to say that there often really isn't a shared reality to draw on. Thus, while the predominant discourse on emotion in politics today tends to advocate, at best, for a return to reason or even a faith in science in the face of our contemporary fractured media environment, this book begins from the premise that the politics of emotion are currently and have been historically, intimately, and necessarily bound up with the politics of social difference, of race, gender, religion, nation, and nationalism, and so forth. Questions of whose feelings matter or what emotions materialize as news are questions about whose claims to legitimacy and authority can be made visible and intelligible in public spaces. In short, we can't just wish emotion out of politics. Rather, we have to better understand what affect does in shaping our political realities.
Promoting white supremacy, male supremacy, and racism are fundamentally affective enterprises. Emotions and affect are not merely individually and privately experienced, but are socially constructed and perpetuated through institutions and persistent mediated repetitions that facilitate large-scale, collectively shared perceptions and myths, such as nationalism and patriotism, ideas of us and them, and who is considered a threatening other. Of course, propaganda has always exploited emotion and desire, which raises the question, what exactly is different today? We might say that we are witnessing a perfect storm. The shifting role of social media in shaping the news media landscape, the capacity of actors to connect, network, and organize online, and the growing level of strategic use of disinformation by various actors. All of these things have created this perfect storm for new modalities of sophisticated propaganda, all of which exploit, target, or manage emotions in distinctive ways.
So from today's vantage point, we know so much more than 2016, of course. We know so much more about how the media landscape has been restructured with pervasive disinformation, and how political actors are using social media for electioneering and propaganda, how algorithms are reshaping public spheres. Some of these key stories that have been unfolding over the past several years, as many of you have surely followed, evidence the weaponization of emotions for economic, political, and often military aims. And those include, get ready for a beleaguering list, the emotional micro-targeting of messages through the application of behavioral science to social media algorithms, as we learned from the Cambridge Analytica scandal, the history of Facebook's emotion experiments dating back to 2008, computational propaganda that relies on bots and organized disinformation campaigns, especially used to sow confusion and mistrust, which is on the rise internationally. The wide popularity of conspiracy theories, which erode trust in common and shared sources of news and fuel paranoia. The rise of authoritarian leaders like Trump, Modi, Bolsonaro, who've successfully weaponized the potent affects underlying racism and bigotry via social media platforms, using their messaging to change the direction or norms of public discourse. The sensationalism that helps drive clickbait journalism, symptomatic of the erosion of long-form and investigative journalism, as news media compete for attention in a digital media environment. Extremist organizing online in forums like 4chan, 8chan, and now Gab and private messaging apps that, among other things, gamify online harassment and campaigns and exploit desires for connection and community. Today we know much more about how algorithms shape information diets, notably promoting fear and hate to sell extremist content, as in the much reported case of YouTube. And finally, the major dissymmetry and partisan exploitation of digital affect, or put differently, not all political groups are having the same degree of success in affectively weaponizing digital tools to manipulate the political landscape. To comprehend the exploitation of new modalities of propaganda requires grasping the degree to which right-wing media producers have successfully weaponized media. And our panelists today discuss these topics and much more in their contributions to this edited collection.
So although propaganda and persuasion have always relied on emotional appeals, digital media have ushered in propaganda by other means, new strategies for mobilizing and capturing affect and emotion. The presentations that we've lined up next take up various aspects of the affective politics of digital media. We are so grateful to the authors who contributed their work to this book and who've joined us here today. And thank you, Anthony Nadler, Sunha Hong, Sam Wooley, Merlina Lim, Zainab Feroki, and Zizi Papacharissi. So we will now briefly introduce each of the speakers as they present, beginning with Anthony. Over to you, Elizabeth.
Great, and just a reminder for those who came in a little bit late, this presentation is being recorded, and we ask that all non-presenters please turn off your camera and please mute your microphone. So, beginning with Dr. Anthony Nadler. Dr. Nadler is an associate professor of media and communication studies at Ursinus College. His research focuses on conservative news, media and populism, and debates surrounding targeted advertising and civic culture in the digital media landscape. So we will turn it over to you.
Thank you, Elizabeth and Megan, both for all the work that went into putting together this book and for putting together this this event. I'm going to try to share my screen. I think this should do it. For just quick slides that will hopefully help give a little bit of shape to what I'm talking about. So the chapter that I contributed to this collection looks at three influential figures in conservative media, Rush Limbaugh, Matt Drudge, and Andrew Breitbart. And over the last 30 plus years, so kind of the dawn of the post-broadcast era into the digital era of media, I argue that these three have helped construct a countercultural style or sensibility in conservative media, and that this has become one of the most important emotional nerve centers in conservative politics today. In this chapter, I draw on textual analysis and biographical and autobiographical writing from and about these three figures. But since 2017, I've also been conducting in-depth interviews with conservative news consumers and some journalists and editors that work at conservative outlets. And particularly in those interviews with consumers, I consistently find that the emotional responses and reactions to politics that the interviewees share with me, there's a lot of resemblance to the structure of feeling that's articulated by these countercultural conservatives that I'm going to sort of spell out its logic right here. It's what I'm calling a sort of deep story about the nature of political life, a really emotionally charged story, and it provides a filter for making sense of political conflict that helps to mobilize a set of affects and feelings. So I'll try to boil this down into three propositions of what the countercultural conservative story is. First is that countercultural conservatives tell a story in which conservatism is a deeply held social identity, not just an ideology or set of policy preferences, and sometimes not even an ideology at all. Limbaugh, Drudge, and Breitbart spend relatively little time in their programming focusing on conservative principles or laying out a moral ideological vision. And this is quite a contrast from conservative media stars and broadcast figures of the past, from religious right figures like Pat Robertson, or some more highbrow figures from the post-war years, William F. Buckley or Clarence Mannion. So what is conservatism for Limbaugh, Drudge, and Breitbart? What I argue in this essay is that they hailed their audiences as members of an embattled cultural identity. Conservatism here is first and foremost a personal and group characteristic that is looked down upon by liberals. They seek to reclaim this identity by linking it to authenticity and to rebellion. In the topsy-turvy world of countercultural conservatism, liberalism, and sometimes leftism too, represents a socially conformist way of thinking, and liberals seek to degrade and excommunicate conservatives from polite society. The liberal disdain for conservatives in this narrative stems from fear. Conservative authenticity threatens a fragile liberal worldview that has to be protected from inconvenient truths. So two, countercultural conservatives constantly agitate a sense among their publics that their identities, public's identities, as conservatives is under threat of shame and stigma. Long before the term cancel culture was tossed around with abandon by conservative media, people like Limbaugh, Drudge, and Breitbart were constantly reminding their audiences that leftists and liberals saw them as moral failures, as too stupid and too backwards to be taken seriously in the public sphere. And this motif is sort of played out in story after story, woven in not just in stories about sort of like liberal aggression, but in the telling of kind of everyday events in these news media. There's a lot to say here about how this political identity intersects with race, class, gender, religion, and other identities, but I'm going to bracket that now for time. Many liberal and left critics have come to realize how central aggrievement and victimization is in conservative discourses. But I think that critics tend to underplay how this narrative conjures a sense of victimhood around the trope of liberals being out to shame and humiliate conservatives. We miss how powerful these narratives are when they represent liberalism and leftism as a denunciation of individual moral failures and of communities and sort of conservative associated communities as being cultures of moral failure. Third, so after hailing audiences as a group under threat of stigma and shame, countercultural conservatives swoop in to defend the honor. And this is sort of move that they always make, defend the honor of the group that they're championing. And this is where the defiant spirit and celebration of conservative grit, rebellion, and authenticity comes in. Countercultural conservatives first invoke a threat against their audience, then they provide a counter narrative that's redeeming and empowering in the face of that threat. So I just want to briefly address one of the questions that Elizabeth and Megan posed for us, which is how do you see emotion being weaponized in this context, at least sort of in the origins of this countercultural conservative milieu. And I think George Cherian George's book, Hate Spin, which is a really provocative study of right-wing religious movements across several countries, is important here. And he argues that these movements depend upon a double-sided mobilization of both offense giving, so saying really offensive things, and offense taking. George observes that critics of the movements are often key into the offense giving side of their operations, but they tend to understand much less about what he calls the, quote, manufacture of offendedness. And yet it's this offendedness, this cultivating a sense of outrage, a sense that your opponents see you as nothing but sort of moral badness, that really fuels the political energies of these movements. Sorry, George argues that opponents of right-wing religious movements usually fail to see this process because they succumb to what he calls a myth of spontaneous rage that sort of naturalizes the offendedness of religious fundamentalists or right-wing religious mobilizations as if it's a kind of organic cultural process and not something that has to be manufactured and prompted by political intermediaries. I think it can be tempting to draw upon this myth of spontaneous outrage in appropriating or in trying to understand secular conservative media as well. Many see it as just a mere reflection of audiences' pre-existing intolerances, prejudices, and rage. But I argue that to grasp the power of countercultural conservatism and the influence it's had on our, at least on US political culture at large, I think we need to look at the deep stories that offer a scaffolding for conservative offense taking and consider how these stories, which are more than just mere bits of information, sort of long-running motifs and sets of sort of deep structures, can activate emotions and affects and not merely reflect them. Thanks.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. I really enjoyed Anthony's chapter. It provides such an interesting historical backdrop. Highly recommend it. I think it'll be very useful in teaching as well. We now move to introduce Sunha Hong. Sunha Hong is assistant professor of communication at Simon Fraser University. Dr. Hong's current research analyzes the contested legacy of the Enlightenment in modern technoculture and analyzes the fantasies, values, and sentimentalities surrounding big data and AI. Welcome.
Thank you. I'll just share the screen and get started straight away. So staying with the US, in many ways piggybacking on Anthony's fantastic work, I want to talk to you about these two images from each, about this uncanny resonance between, on one hand, the slogan made famous in the Trump rallies, fuck your feelings, and the conservative influence of Ben Shapiro's self-appointed slogan, fact don't care about your feelings. And I'll sort of come back to this as the bookend. But I suppose what I'm trying to get to here is in 2016, when this photo was taken, and even now, a lot of the conversation is around fake news or post-truth, right? The decline and fall of the good old modern world where we all supposedly listen to scientists and fact were simply fact. Except, to borrow the words of Nuntia Mars, I am also struck, she says, by the convenience of this position and the creative interpretation of the recent past on which it relies. That is to say, we have never lived in a world where facts were facts without contestation. And as a corollary to that, we have always lived in an information ecosystem where the claim to fact and reason is also a claim to power, to legitimacy, and to certain terrains of affect. And today, it is precisely in the eye of the storm, in the most influential super spreaders of disinformation, that's where we actually find a loud and performative commitment to the idea of facts, reason, numbers, proof. It is this idea that it is we who see the truth with our sharp eyes and sharp brain, the truth that the MSM or the scientists will not or cannot say. So this idea of being on the right side of fact and reason becomes a crucial source of moral righteousness, a sense of affective solidarity, something to gather around and raise the banner. And it is that refuge, ultimately, of the feeling of certainty, a certain escape from complicity, a certain escape from having to always question and doubt and change the ground on which you stand. So to better understand some of these trends, my chapter looks in particular at Ben Shapiro as perhaps the best example of the continuities between MSM, so to speak, and social media influencers in the US context. Because when we talk about the American right, Shapiro is both old and new. He commands enormous reach over social media platforms. The Daily Wire, which he co-founded with money from fracking billionaires, the Wilks brothers, has a rate of Facebook engagement, as you can see here, that far exceeds America's largest legacy media outlets. And in terms of absolute engagement numbers, I think they're comparable with the New York Times. And this is done in part by exploiting and gaming the system with large networks of shadow pages, which Facebook knowingly allows them to do as part of Mark Zuckerberg's years-long strategy of essentially bending the rules for folks like Alex Jones and Ben Shapiro. But Shapiro has also cultivated his personal brand not only through new media, but through appearances on mainstream media over the years, including the legacy of populist media that Anthony's just talked about. And so Shapiro did time at Breitbart before founding the Daily Wire, for instance. The area that I want to focus on here, though, is how influencers like Shapiro help dress up familiar political talking points in the trappings of fact and reason. And he provides a narrative where it's like a heroic defense of fundamental universal values. His performances constantly emphasize how he and his listeners are the last bastion of fact and reason, science and philosophy against a quote-unquote radical left that privileges mushy feelings. Shapiro accordingly presents himself as a Harvard Law School prodigy, borrowing legitimacy from the same elite universities that he regularly pillories. He's also successfully roped in mainstream media into covering him in this way, with the New York Times once infamously calling him the cool kids philosopher, providing him with priceless oxygen of amplification. The interesting thing, though, is influencers like Shapiro typically spend a lot of time talking about how they are for fact and reason, and very little time actually exercising any kind of research or analysis. Their content will parasitically feed on the mainstream media, the left, and other designated enemies, who are then, as you can see here, destroyed and crushed for their unreason. So all of this I describe in the chapter as what I call fact signaling. It is a weaponization of the idea of fact and reason, which isn't necessarily connected to the actual engagement with data or research. It can be, but it doesn't have to be. Rather, its primary aim is about cultivating affective solidarity, the idea that we are on the right side of history, we don't have to doubt ourselves, and we have a way to establish some basis of certainty for navigating social and political life. So for me, there's an essential connection that is betrayed in this off-kilter resonance between fuck your feelings and facts don't care about your feelings. Emerging cultures of fact signaling, I would argue, remix a very specific imagination of modern reason as an adversarial conflict. And so, despite the active invocation of the legacy of Western modernity by influences like Shapiro, there is very little sign of, for example, the idea that scientific inquiry involves an indefinite search for hypotheses, where what we know is never final and we must always question our own premises. That doesn't get told so much. Instead, the story that they prefer is where Shapiro can loudly proclaim again and again, a man is a man and a woman is a woman, and apparently that is sufficient to dismiss non-binary rights. So I want to leave you here with this idea that it's increasingly crucial to map out the ways in which the trappings of fact and reason are being appropriated in the service of disinformation for platform-boosted cycles of outrage and mockery, the pleasure of destroying one's enemies in the name of reason. Thank you. I'll stop there.
Thank you. I'm sure already we have tons of questions. I'm sure we have tons of questions brewing in the chat already. and among our audience members, but we will keep our questions for the end time. Next, we're going to turn to Dr. Samuel Woolley. Dr. Woolley is the Program Director of Propaganda Research at the Center for Media Engagement and an Assistant Professor of Journalism at the University of Texas at Austin. Dr. Woolley studies computational propaganda and the use of automation and algorithms in attempts to manipulate public opinion. Welcome, Dr. Woolley.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for having me. Trying to make the most of the nice weather finally in Austin, so excuse any background noise. I'm on the patio. It's great to be here. Today, I'm going to talk to you a little bit briefly about our study, which was focused upon one of the groups I think is often a core target of misinformation, disinformation, and organized hate campaigns on social media, and that's journalists. We oftentimes, think about the ways in which what others have called computational propaganda or network propaganda affect broad informational ecosystems. But one of the things I've been trying to do in my research more recently is look at the groups that oftentimes are more affected. And so journalists came to mind as key among them. There's a few provocations that were offered by the organizers here. And the first was, in what way we see emotion in media being weaponized in political context today. And in our research, which was a series of interviews with journalists from around the United States and major newspapers and a number of dailies and smaller cities, as well as a large survey of over 1,000 journalists at a number of different newspapers reporting on a number of different topics across the country, we found that social media and emotion on social media, in the form oftentimes of false information or targeted harassment, was oftentimes leveraged at journalists, even journalists working at local news outlets. We also found that there's a few key points about the ways in which it was leveraged against these journalists. The first was that journalists were oftentimes targeted with private harassment and public harassment on social media platforms ranging from Twitter to Facebook to YouTube, and that they felt that there was an uptick in these kinds of attacks. The other thing is that journalists felt that they did not have adequate training, despite the fact that they had overwhelmingly, I believe it was over 70% of the journalists we talked to, begun to report on the problem of false information in the last couple of years. And so there was a very deep feeling of concern amongst the community about the fact that there was a lack of preparedness amongst news organizations, ranging from the Wall Street Journal and the Washington Post, all the way to the San Diego Union Tribune and the Austin American Statesman, about the fact that the organizations that were backing these journalists did not know how to deal with the ways in which social media was being leveraged against these people professionally, but also how the journalists themselves were working to cover this kind of content. So even the best newspapers in the United States, or at least the most well-respected, I should say, did not have instituted programs at the time we were studying this to actually address how their reporters were affected, either psychologically, emotionally, but also how to deal with this stuff professionally. This has changed a bit in the interim. There's been some movement in this direction. Some of the more influential and more well-resourced newspapers in the country have begun to deploy resources to support journalists who are who are emotionally affected by this content, psychologically affected, and also professionally affected. But it's very slow progress. And the long story short of all of this is that we need better approaches to supporting journalists, but also we need a more unified approach, it seems, and this is something that many of the journalists agreed on when we spoke to, in helping to create journalistic best practices for addressing what's known as false content or reporting upon false content, and also responding to false content. Suffice to say that this sort of relatively new phenomenon or new risen concern around this issue has created a lot of distrust amongst the news media itself, and a lot of strife, and there is massive need for this one. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Sam. I'm so glad that we were able to have Anthony, Sunha, and Sam speak one after the other, because there's a lovely synergy between those chapters in particular. Now for another synergy between Dr. Lim and Zainab Feroki, and first allow me to introduce Dr. Lim. Dr. Merlina Lim is Canada Research Chair in Digital Media and Global Network Society at Carleton University. Her research and publications revolve around socio-political implications of media and technology. Using empirical evidence from the Global South, Dr. Lim's current research explores digitization, datification, and algorithmic processes and their implications in diverse contexts. Dr. Lim.
Thank you so much for the introduction, Dr. Boler, and thank you, Elizabeth and Dr. Davis for inviting. Thank you, everybody. It's my pleasure to be here. So to broadly contextualize my chapter in today's context, it is essentially a attempt to understand how communities or clusters such as anti-mask, anti-vaccine, right-wing groups during the election, US election, but also in other elections in all over the world, were formed online from the perspective of social media algorithms. So my chapter emphasizes the importance of user information-seeking behavior in their interaction and in the interaction between human user and social media platform. I also try to offer an alternative conceptual framework that captures the complexity and dynamics of the relationship between people and technology. In my analysis, I specifically employ affects, emotion as a central element of analysis to unpack the complexity of the algorithmic environment of social media. And in establishing my framework, I anchor my analysis in 3 accounts. The first one is by exploring affect as the currency of neoliberal media landscape to contextualize its role and prominence in the social media landscape. In this section, I basically argue that online activities that are taking place in social media environment, such as liking, sharing, posting, commenting, are largely driven by emotion. So these activities are a form of human context where the emotion is passed from one another. In other words, in social media network, the production and management of affect is a constant feature that connects one user with another. Communication network here, conceived here are constitutively affective. Affect is manufactured and accumulated from reciprocal and circular communication. So in a neoliberal social media landscape, affect is the currency, representing a medium of exchange or an intermediary instrument used to facilitate human transaction between individual and groups. And second is by examining the logic and principle of social media sorting algorithms and their implication on the formation of discourse. The underpinning typology of social media algorithm is a sorting algorithm, which essentially is an algorithm that put elements of a list in a certain orders, such as numerical or lexicographical orders. So in the affective network, social media algorithms are largely designed to enhance targeted advertisement and built on sorting algorithms. These combinations pushes them to be biased toward the superlative, notably contents that generate extreme binary affective gesture, such as love and hate. And to follow that on that, to illustrate how the affective-based algorithms is actually amplify binary rhetoric politics and therefore facilitate the kind of extreme type of binary political cluster, I use empirical snapshot from Indonesia to discuss what I call algorithmic enclaves, a concept that can possibly explain the emergence of effective political class take place in social media. So because of the combination of the politic itself is already binary, the combination between that binary politics and binary rhetorics with the affective-based algorithm resulted what I call algorithmic enclaves. So the neoliberal social media landscape, affective networks, and social media algorithms, together they assemble a habitat that privileges and encourages the emergence of political clusters that resort to binary affective rhetorics, anti-mask or pro-mask, anti and pro-climate change, anti and pro-vaccine, etc. In a political condition where polarizing binary politics or binary discourse are entrenched, affective political enclaves, especially those that are based on extreme emotions, such as hate and love, are more likely to emerge on social media. Each of these enclaves is an algorithmic enclaves, which is a discursive arena where individuals afforded by social media algorithm voluntarily form an affective political cluster that is exclusively developed to promote the well-being, rights, and interests of their own while negating the rights of the others. That's the end of it. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Lim. Next, I will introduce Zainab Feroki. Zainab Feroki is a doctoral candidate in the Women and Gender Studies Institute and Diaspora and Transnational Studies at the University of Toronto. Her research focuses on the transnational aspects of right-wing extremist groups, paying specific attention to the gendered dimensions of the development of right-wing extremism in India, Canada, and the United States.
Thank you, Elizabeth and Megan, for inviting me and for organizing this panel. So the name of my chapter is Hindu Nationalism News Channel and Post-Truth Twitter, a case study of love jihad. Sorry, I just want to make sure that you see my slides, right? Okay. So in India, as some of you may know, anti-Muslim prejudice has spiked dramatically since the right-wing Hindu nationalist BJP attained power in 2014. So BJP's propagation of Hindu nationalism, the belief that India is a Hindu nation and belongs first to Hindus, has fostered some sort of hatred and demonization of Muslims. In fact, Muslim demonization and vilification are at the heart of the Hindu nationalist movement, where the depiction of Muslim as the despicable others create the very possibility of upholding Hindu identity and Hindu civilizational glory. So since BJP came to power, fake information and conspiracies about Muslims have been disseminated through both social and mainstream media. My chapter in this collection addresses one of the widest spread conspiracies about Muslims on social media called the Love Jihad campaign. So the Love Jihad campaign is a campaign that is started by right-wing Hindu nationalists in 2009, alleging that Muslim men fake love to learn non-Muslim women and marry them in order to convert them to Islam. The exponents of this conspiracy assert that the innocent Hindu women are converted to Islam in order to increase the Muslim population thereby waging a jihad or holy war against Hindus. So I draw on this case of love jihad to show how two right-wing English mainstream news channel, and namely Republic TV and Times Now, have used Twitter to sort of amplify affective propaganda, perpetuating fear and anxiety about Muslims, thereby polarizing Hindus and Muslims and mobilizing Hindu voters to bring a Hindu party into power. These news channels use Twitter to manipulate and manufacture public opinion against Muslim community to further the Hindu to vote political agenda. So Twitter has been very crucial in constructing the phenomenon of love jihad, bringing this issue to a global level, allowing supporters who endorse this campaign to sort of build alliances and create some sort of transnational Islamophobic community. So I drew on the concept of digital governmentality, which function based on three regimes of governmentality that governs user behavior in digital ecosystem, namely incentive, design, and frame. So the incentive regime of governmentality encourages certain outcomes through guidance, right, and coercion. I drew on the incentive regime of digital governmentality to explain how both news channels use Twitter to sort of orchestrate, direct, and manipulate the online mode of conduct of individuals in affective ways. While the interactive nature of social media allows participants to express their idea and opinion, discourse on Muslim vis-a-vis Hindus is directly or indirectly engineered through these affective incentives by these channels. So, my research involved analyzing different rhetorical strategies that were used to spread the love jihad discourse. Those rhetorical strategies that I found were the deployment of sensational props, question format headline, repetition, and deployment of hashtags, among others. So let me show you some of the tweets that these strategies were used. For instance, it says, love jihad is a dimension of terrorism. Hashtag love jihad name. Hashtag Hindu girls hunted. And love jihad is a way for these extremists to prey upon women. Hashtag love jihad debate. Forced conversion a reality? Question mark. Laird, converted, and pack off to Syria. Those who survive speak on Republic TV. So what you see here in these tweets, the mainstream media use the rhetorical strategy of hashtags, repetition, question mark, as well as sensational props such as hunted or layered, converted, among others, to sort of establish the love jihad conspiracy as a truth and to provoke individuals to contribute to this so-called truth. By using these rhetorical strategies, the channel amplify affective propaganda and perpetuate fear and anxiety about Muslims. So we can see here how digital media, politics, and affects are sort of intersected in the case of love jihad. This case of love jihad shows how the news channel co-opted Twitter to heighten the efficacy of mainstream media, creating a discursive, affective environment that harnesses a culture of fear and suspicion towards Muslims. So in conclusion, what is evident here is that Twitter is being used by these channels to further the polarization between Hindu and Muslim for political purposes, to produce and diffuse disinformation about Muslim, and to provoke non-Muslim to circulate anti-Muslim rhetoric themselves. The case of love jihad is an excellent empirical example of how propaganda and emotionality have, through digital media, come into a new digital discursive configuration, putting some feelings such as fear and hatred in motion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Zainab. Such interesting work. And I have the pleasure now of introducing, last but not least, Dr. Zizi Papacharissi. There's a wonderful set of interviews in our collection. And one of the interviews is with Dr. Papacharissi and Susanna Passanen, who will be in the book panel event that's happening next Tuesday, the 20th. Dr. Zizi Papacharissi is professor and head of communication and professor of political science at the University of Illinois at Chicago. She has published 10 books on the social and political implications of technology. Her latest book is titled After Democracy, and I understand she's giving a talk about this today at University of Austin. So if you want to put that information in the chat, please do, Zizi. She is founding and current editor of the open access journal Social Media and Society. Over to you.
Thank you, Megan. It's such a pleasure. First of all, thank you for including me in the book. It was wonderful to chat with Susanna and all of you and be part of this conversation. And also, it's such a pleasure to be included among this group of scholars who are presenting what I think is just really cutting edge, futuristic research. So I really thank you for the opportunity to share my thoughts and be part of this greater conversation. I've taken a few notes so as to not run the risk of speaking for 3 hours. Most of my own work focuses on the social and political structures of the net and the many platforms that it supports. I have not always studied affect. About 10 years ago, I became interested in structures, soft structures of feeling, and news storytelling or affect and civic engagement. And since then, I have found the concept very meaningful in describing structures of participation, structures of information and disinformation and understanding them, ways in which we align with particular groups online and through social media, and also understanding social movements and how they develop and attain a digital imprint, if you will. It's wonderful to see the many illustrations of sentiment analysis that are being described as different forms and iterations of affect. You know, when I started using the term, I struggled explaining it to fellow scholars. One of my first studies was on the uprisings in Egypt that led to the overthrow of Hosni Mubarak. And in describing those early findings, my colleagues often confused affect with emotion. I was questioned, I was asked, well, Zizi, are you sure that what you're seeing here is affect and not just simply joy? And I would hurry to explain that, you know, what is lying behind this stream is not really one specific emotion, but rather a number of different predispositions that have not yet formed towards a particular direction and may yet develop towards a variety of different logics and emotions, or logics and emotions put together. I became interested in affect because I did not understand how people are able to separate reason from emotion. And I don't think that people who try to separate reason from emotion are 100% human or 100% very happy people. So I wanted to understand that connection between reason and emotion, and I found it in affect. I want to say a few things that underpin my understanding of the internet, social media, democracy, non-democracy, technology in general. First of all, technology in any spaces that it enables, including the internet. You know, the internet itself, the platforms that it supports, it's not a magical space. It cannot create on its own something that does not exist. On its own, it doesn't create or destroy democracy. It also doesn't, the internet, any of these platforms, they do not democratize, but they do pluralize. They open up more connections and pathways to connections, but those paths do not necessarily lead to democracy. They connect, obviously, democratically oriented people, but also fascists. And finally, these technologies amplify, but not on equal terms. You know, all voices are equal online, but some voices are more equal than others, is what I like to say. They do not create, these technologies, these platforms, hate speech, but they certainly make it more visible. They make it more easily spreadable. When we first made the turn to affect and news storytelling, we were interested in exactly that. What forms of news storytelling, what forms of then, getting to the truth do these platforms support? And we are very intrigued by the collaborative aesthetic and practices that were being cultivated in those very early streams between citizens and journalists who were working together to verify the truth. Again, in one of the most earnest streams that I've studied on Twitter, the one that described the happenings of the early days of the Egypt revolution, we were struck by how many cases and the instantaneity of the communication between citizens and journalists abroad, and the need, the tendency, the emphasis on conveying information, but also correcting information almost instantaneously. How responsive citizens were to that, and how responsive journalists were to that, and also how effectively attuned both parties were to this process of preserving and maintaining the autonomy of the narrative of the movement, but also the autonomy of the truth. And that was the last time I saw something like that, such earnestness in place on Twitter and also in other similar media. We developed a couple of concepts through integrating affect with just sort of more traditional ways of understanding news storytelling, and also forms of civic participation that we've developed in political science and communication. The first term that we use a lot is the idea of affective news, which refers to the form that information curation often takes online. It is characterized by an obsession with instantaneity, of course, a sense of flattening of the news, some loss of substance, some loss of context, no sense of the so what question, but rather constant repetition of the same headlines or breaking news tags over and over again. So some examples are that, way back we heard a lot about, Hillary's notorious emails, but we never really got to understand what the story, what was in those emails even. More recently, we hear a lot about the defund the police movement, but we don't exactly hear detailed reporting on exactly all of that involves. This form of news curation, of inviting then the public to participate in news storytelling, on the one hand, yes, it might possibly sustain feelings of community that reflexively drive a movement forward, but there's no telling, which direction that movement is going to take and what level of populism it's going to attain. I will talk about populism in 1 second. The second concept that we came up with is, I think, the quite meaningful one of affective publics, which we understand as network publics that are brought together, identified, or disbanded through bonds of sentiment. They connect, these publics connect around shared atmospheres, shared moods, shared predispositions, things that are not yet fully developed, directions or intentions or intentionalities. These publics bond around intentionality in the making. And again, it's very important to understand that there is no specific direction. This could, depending on context, this could evolve in a variety of different ways, as my co-panelists have demonstrated so eloquently. The impact of these publics is not going to be instantaneous or political or socioeconomic or cultural. And again, let me emphasize, perhaps the most important thing is it will not be instantaneous. These publics can affect great symbolic impact, right? So the statement, the hashtag Black Lives Matter is one that that carries great symbolic gravitas. These publics also lay claim to agency in a semantic manner through the discursive renegotiation of key terms. So when we say defund the police, we're not obviously conveying that in a literal sense. We're not saying fire all cops now. but we're engaging in a discursive renegotiation of the institutional meaning of policing, what policing means in a contemporary society, what it should be about. And the first step towards change, right, in order to reimagine our institutions, we first have to renegotiate our vocabulary, the words that we use to describe them with, the words that we use to define their meaning. And then the last thing to keep in mind is that the power that these publics access is liminal. And this makes us hopeful when we see movements that feel like they're propagating change, meaningful change forward, and also fearful when we see publics like the mobs that stormed the Capitol building on January 6th, fills us with fear. But again, we have to remember that is a liminal access, a transitional access to power, and will remain liminal as long as it doesn't have sustained bonds to hard institutional structures. Last thing, because I think we should turn over to questions and conversation. The tags or the affective markers that we tend to coalesce around algorithmically or just intuitively, they work as open signifiers, right? They are ways for us to stand up and be counted. I think many of you illustrated this point. Populism works in a variety of different directions. There's some literature that makes the argument that all populism is bad. Others make the argument that there is good and bad populism. I would say that I follow Laclau's work a lot and use the concept of open signifiers to understand the forms of engagement that these phenomena that we observe and try to understand enable. And I would say that we need new vocabulary to understand populism and to also understand how then these platforms amplify and enable populism. If you want to call it a post-truth world, I would agree with those who say that, we've never really had ownership of the facts or of the truth. I would say that the truth is no longer enough, and also remind us all that the truth is many things, but it's also a mechanism for affective belonging, for expressing solidarity. All of us choose the truths that allow us to belong to certain groups, and often in our personal lives choose to ignore truths that make us feel insecure or uncomfortable. I think the key lies in understanding what then the affect of the truth is, and becoming perhaps more literate with communicating and sharing, conveying it, and also bonding around it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Zizi. Well, we will now see if there are some comments or questions between the panelists for a few moments before we open up to question and answer with the audience. And thank you all so much for these wonderful remarks and keeping a bit to time, because we have some good time for Q&A. So do the panelists have any comments or questions for one another? It's so lovely to be able to actually have a conversation with the contributors.
I can pose a question that I'd be curious to hear some folks' thoughts on. Partly this is, I've been reading a lot about sort of the role of about critical intellectuals in the mid-20th century, and I'm thinking about I guess the role. I'm curious what y'all think is the contribution or lack thereof that research into affective digital politics has to play in terms of I guess whether it's social movement strategy or affecting sort of political actors outside of academia. So that's for anybody who wants to take a bite of that.
I think it's using the term affect is just it's not the easiest term to explain or to to use, and it's often misunderstood, and people think you're talking about affect and not affect. I often resort to the term sentiment if I'm trying to communicate to broader public, so as to just kind of sort of get straight to the point and explain what it is that I'm saying. If they want to engage in lengthier conversation, I will take the time to explain, and give some examples. And because I do think it's fascinating how affect works. Also from a neuroscience perspective, how it's observed through a variety of living organisms. But I think some of the challenge lies in the complexity of the term. But I'm hopeful because in the past 10 years, I think we've seen some brilliance and very extroverted applications of the term.
To take it from another tack as well, I think part of this also comes down to this kind of what kind of authority or what kind of authority we peg when we typically talk about when people typically talk about fact and reason and emotion and affect and sentiment and all of these things, right? And so sometimes it's a response of, are you dismissing the epistemic content of some of this by calling it affective, which it is not? Or, are you, which bit is the fact and which bit is the affect? And then I think it becomes a matter of parsing it. And this is sort of the legacy of the mainstreaming of certain behavioral and cognitive science way of thinking about human behavior, right? Either you're working as a well-oiled machine based on the truth, or you're wishy-washy, snowflakey, so on and so forth. And I think part of what we can do and part of what affect can do is usefully complicate some of those feelings that we have about these words. And Zizi, when you mention, things like sentiment, it strikes me so much because there's also a history here of how we have talked about sensibility or sensing. And so one of the things I look at is this Enlightenment tradition of thinking about that and all these debates that they used to have about how sensibility isn't something you're born with. Is it a product of your education? And then of course that spawned a lot of horribly problematic things about how do we educate minorities and other abnormal people into having the right sensibility. But I think that just goes towards, again, demonstrating how a sense of stability or sense of thinking something is plausible or saying something smells or seems like the truth or trustworthy, all of that, it doesn't come from your gut as a kind of a naturalized thing, right? And Zizi, I know you know all this, right? I'm sort of bouncing it off you, but to say, again, these are things we can bring out into the open a little bit and complicate and saying, no, these aren't things we're born with. And these are also things that we become cultivated with. And the most striking thing about this idea that you've got to do your own research and know your own truth is that actually you do it by listening to Ben Shapiro and Alex Jones for 3 hours a day, right? And they talk for a long, long time. So there's that mediation aspect of it too.
I really like this question. I think thanks all those great ones in TC. Anthony, I like this idea of what do we do to actually connect this to activist groups, to movement-based organizations, to civil society. And as Zizi rightly points out, affect is a difficult term to parse even for us, right? And so as we work to do this sort of translation work for others, for civil society, I think it's really important that we figure out ways that we can describe what we're finding in an action-oriented way. Because oftentimes, when I set out to study computational propaganda myself, at least 10 years ago, I was a qualitative scholar and I wanted to talk to the people who are making and building systems to spread this misinformation and purposefully manipulate content via social media. as time has gone on, I've found that what I'm more interested in knowing is how are they working to use these systems to attempt to manipulate people in various groups. And so the big pivot for me now at UT has been, okay, how do I take what I learned from propagandists and actually explain it to civil society groups and say, hey, here's what propagandists say, for better or worse, whether it's in India or Mexico, Brazil, or the United States. Here's how they say they're attempting to pull your strings. And I don't know, as a qualitative scholar, as someone doesn't talk in general terms much of the time, I say to them very honestly, I don't know if this works. I don't know, so you need to take this with a pinch of salt. So that's another thing as well, I think, like making sure that we offer caveats and we're very clear about the fact that we don't have a direct effects model, that maybe it's secondary or tertiary effects, and being more honest about that is really important. I take kind of, I take umbrage. I was going to say the word umbrage, and I just think it's a really funny word. I don't know why. But anyway, I take umbrage with a lot of the research out there that says that we don't know that there are effects of this stuff. And I would say, push back on that and say, actually, it's not that we don't know that there are effects. It's that the models that we have for tracking effect are very much focused on primary effect, and that we haven't yet built good systems for understanding those secondary and tertiary effects. And until we do, we need to be very careful about what we say, how we say it. And I think Kate Starbird, for instance, has been talking about this for quite a while, at least on Twitter. And so I'm hoping to see some more work from her on this. But those are my perspectives on how we talk to civil society groups. And if anyone ever wants to talk about this, I'd be more than happy to, because my pivot with my lab right now is towards working more with movement-based organizations like STOP and Color of Change, and helping to do this translation. And I'm kind of scratching my head on how to do it. So
I would like to add a little bit, which is kind of like related to what Zizi said. The term effect is kind of like difficult to understand at first, and on stage, right, social movement groups or politicians that I talked with, they didn't want to admit that affect or emotion or sentiment is important. But off stage, right? So on stage, they would like to post that they are logical, they operate based on truth and then scientific fact and fact, statistics, and etc., etc. But off stage, when you talk especially with social media consultants that they actually hire and activists on the ground, right? Like underground, when you're talking about really what is the most important for you? You want to excite people, you want to sell, you want to make people love you. So basically, it's not like they just deny it, because it's not necessarily positive to really claim that effect is the most important thing, right? But actually, I think behind the scene, especially with the prominence of social media consultant during the election, sentiment analysis essentially is about effect. Then that's the biggest thing, right? And I look at the election all over the world. That's number one. That's why they operate to sort of like using extreme sensational information. So while we might not really hear the word effect, but it is really embedded actually in the operational day-to-day operation of these political clusters and even beyond. Yeah. Thank you.
I'm so glad you brought that up, Marlena, because that was one of the motivations, I think, for doing this work, and the work I know that I'm continuing to do, and many of us, is to catch up, as it were, to have some of our scholarship, particularly qualitative or humanities-based scholarship, interdisciplinary work, understand how emotion and affect intersect with social media, because Silicon Valley, the combination of big data and cognitive and behavioral psychology and science is so far ahead of us. And I think without that interdisciplinary understanding, we're not fully going to grasp that. We have a question in the chat, so I'll read it to you. I think it's an important one. And an overall question: the liberals blame algorithms for the rise of alt-right and misinformation. whereas conservatives and libertarians believe algorithms are used to repress conservative views on social media. What do the panelists think about this? So yeah, that tension between liberals blaming algorithms for the rise of the far right and misinformation, and others thinking algorithms are used to repress conservative views. That's certainly what I'm seeing expressed in the research we're doing.
I can super quickly jump in just to say that it's at least in the actors that I often track, like Alex Jones, for example. Sometimes you'll watch some of his videos and his critiques of social media will be some version of essentially academic critique that has been ongoing for a number of years about platform power. So then you might think, oh, there's something going on here. But what's also really important to understand is the performative and strategic role of these arguments, right? So I don't think you can necessarily expect that conservatives, for example, are always going to be they're not. Even right now, they are not consistent in their opposition to censorship and restriction on social media, right? They are very happy for restrictions and moderation to occur when it suits them. So I think this is a question of power, and it is a question of whether they have judged that raising the banner against social media in the time of the tech clash might be a useful way for them to advance their own particular interest in reaching people and building their brands. So I think it's important to recognize the strategic motivations that drive these kinds of arguments. I think otherwise we get trapped into sort of saying, well, are they factually correct or not correct? And what is sort of the logical architecture of their claims? Which is the exact same thing that I face with like Ben Shapiro and others. It's not really about building a really complex theory of Western modernity or truth or Aristotle. There is very little of that at times. It's just more about a very flexible situation from which you can jump in and attack when the going is good and then back out when the cops come in. That's my view, though. Just my view.
Yeah, what he said.
I also think that like some of this has to do with the magical thinking that like surrounds algorithms, right? Like, and using them as a, I don't know, straw man for like anything that goes wrong, or social media companies, similarly as the ball guy in a lot of this stuff. And I do think that, to get back to Anthony's earlier point about how we talk to civil society about this, or how we talk to movement-based or advocacy-based organizations, I think we have to do a lot of work still in figuring out how to let people know that it's not these algorithms, that it's the people behind them. But also, like, a lot of the time, what you think is happening is to do with your own biases, and that's a whole different other thing to unpack. Like, how do you really cement to people what confirmation bias is, belief perseverance effect?
I think I would like to follow up on what Sam just said. I think so. Yeah. So your own bias, right? It's like people forget that algorithms, if you don't use social media, you don't actually interact with algorithms. And this is accumulation of what user do with the algorithm. So, so there is a reality is one thing, and there is visibility, another thing, and another one is perception, which is bias, right? And all these three like will differ from one person to another. Why the right-wing extremists think they are victimized, because what they see is the opposite, right? So, and it is true though, when it comes to visibility, the accumulation of what this extreme group does, the most left or the most right do, they are more amplified, but the sorting algorithm principle. Therefore, they are more visible. The middle, I believe, is actually, at least based on my research, is bigger, except they are not visible. It's not like they are repressed. We just don't see them because our affective interaction, right? Just like and I like. There is no like, I'm not sure whether I like this or not. There is no such button. Therefore, what we see is like, okay, the most like, right? Or now we have more on Facebook, like the most whoa, right? Still, you use sort of like and love. Even when people don't love, people love, click love. That's what we see. I think the visibility of the extreme, that's what actually cloud our judgment about the way algorithm actually work, but not really the way it really works.
One thing I'll add is, I think, speaking especially from, I guess, a sort of humanistic side of this type of work, is also making the case that algorithms are part of a larger social context. And to the extent that we isolate the algorithms as a sort of like first mover or like final cause, I think that probably does, isn't that helpful. At the same time, it's, we, especially in the US, but certainly in, I guess, in North America and in general, a lot of times media structures have been sort of depoliticized. Less so probably in Canada than in the US, but so I think it's important to sort of politicize and contest media structures and suggest that they have real consequences for the sort of shape and sensibilities of the public sphere, but also to really to be able to try to find poignant ways that we can describe a larger social context as opposed to particular levers that are really where all the action is happening.
One of the questions, so many of these questions come up in the research that we're doing. I'm working with a fairly large team, and how emotion drives some of the narratives and deep stories that were being talked about. And I have a great deal of concern. We've now been coding, for 2 years and looking very closely at the relationships and the dynamics, and everything that we might suspect is happening. The binary oppositions of how people speak to each other, and when there is nuance or when there is outlier emotions, those get shut down. There are very distinct feeling rules on every platform and, in fact, every thread. So depending on the thread, the tone that is set by the initial poster tends to dominate, tends to be actually mirrored and reflected in almost everything that comes after. I mean, there's some phenomenal dynamics that we're seeing that are concerning, and differences, though, between the left and the right, and the emotional dynamics, the workings of affect there, the relationship to reason. But everything that folks talked about today, the using facts without evidence, being on the right side of history, there's also uncanny parallels so that one would be concerned that one could say, wow, we're seeing the same dynamics on the left as on the right, but there are important differences. This leads me to one question I would be curious if people have thoughts about, and that is, what is the relationship of skepticism and conspiracy? We're in a inundated information world where we have to think, quote unquote, critically. We have to bring these skeptical skills to information, and we're asking people to do that. And as I've been looking at some of the questions of conspiracy, this question arises. I don't know if people have thoughts about that. There's other questions in the chat if people want to pick those up as well.
Yes, maybe Megan, I'll just add to your question from the chat, as there were a number of questions so I think that's such an interesting question. I'd love to hear what people think about the question of skepticism versus conspiracy, but also folks in the chat were really concerned. There's some concerns with questions of what the individual, what the user is to do in a soundbite economy, when people have short attention spans, how to not reduce complex phenomena. Also questions about how to sort through the kind of deluge of information and who one can rely on, and how we ought to be turning to different sources, and questions about who has the time to do your own research. So I thought I might just add those questions from the chat to your question, Megan.
So I mean, for me, those two questions are super connected. And the reason for that is, so especially with Morton's question in the chat, I want to answer that by pushing back a little bit on this idea of differentiating people who have the time and ability to do reason-based deliberation and do their own research versus people who have to rely on sound bites. I think when we say we're talking about people who are already pressed for resources for relying on emotions, I think that's all of us. And that's not a psychological issue that individuals face. It's a normal consequence of the way our platforms are built and our information ecosystems are being operated today. Chris Gilliard has basically called Facebook, described Facebook as, it's like a factory that takes all the toxic waste from around the world and then blows it up by 10 times and spews it out and then says, oh, it was an accident, right? So I think this is a condition that runs across the political spectrum and across socioeconomic status. But yes, socioeconomic status does matter, but I think it's not the case of some people do their own research and some people don't, and that it's the people who don't that are the problem. It's especially when people do their own research that it becomes easier and easier to fall into these different tracks, right? So the Charleston shooter, the mass shooter, wrote in his manifesto saying, I did a Google search and that's what led me down this road of radicalization. Francesca Tripodi's done amazing work looking at a particular community of American evangelical Catholics, saying when they decided to support Trump, it wasn't that they were stupid and just listening to whatever was on Fox. They were consulting multiple sources and doing way more research than your average media consumer, than most of us, in fact. But they were reading the media in their own way, inflected by their own communal values and their relationship with Bible and so on and so forth. And then they came to this reasoned conclusion that Trump is the person to vote for and so on and so forth. So I think when we think about skepticism and conspiracy and doing our own research and so on and so forth, again, it's not, I think, a simple question of we do our own research and we know the facts, or we don't and we get fooled by others. I think people watch Ben Shapiro precisely as a way of trying to do their own research. Right. And then I think they are increasingly fighting back and increasingly successfully at the normative paradigm that has always said some kind of ideas are just crazy. We're not even going to talk about it. They're conspiracies. They are, flat earth theories. I think people are successfully, for better or for worse, pushing back against those kinds of value judgments. And that is creating even more confusion. I'll stop there because I don't want to go on my own, but I'm going to leave various things unanswered.
There's a question I would love to, thank you, Sanhat, to share with folks from the chat. Nicholas writes, with regards to the weaponization of affect, can't help but wonder, can affect ever have veracity inside the political realm as it does, for example, in the arts?
Interesting question. If I might, one of the things, this idea of the weaponization of affect, one of the things we've been finding again and again and again is a shift away from depersonalized bot-driven techniques that we saw in 2016, where you would just amplification of likes, which still have probably an effect on affect, but also a move towards what we call relational organizing, and so this use of close networks and of nano influencers and of people that can present, the term veracity was used, but this is more presenting authenticity, presenting this notion that I'm more like you. And this is definitely something that Becca Lewis explored in her great piece on YouTube. And it's certainly something that we've seen in other research. I would just say that it's super tied to that idea of skepticism versus conspiracy, and it's tied to the different push and pull factors that exist, right? Because skepticism is not cemented, to me at least, in belief, deep belief, whereas conspiracy is cemented in belief, and it's more cemented in these ideas of these need to belong. And so the people that are weaponizing affect understand this, and they understand that there's loneliness, they understand that there's a need for a community. And yes, I think they do actually make use of maybe not veracity, but authenticity.
I would say actually, yeah, veracity, right? Actually, so because I think it's a mistake to equate affect and irrationality. it's not, right? I think there is truth in affect that is actually embedded in humanity. And in fact, I think we've been using affect for change, for social change. That you steer that is genuine coming from victimization and wars and human suffering. So, except that now it seems to be hijacked with extreme affect. There is irrational and also explosive rather than sitting on sort of like deep humanity. And I think if we are reminded in so many historic, right, changes where a scene that is coming through sort of like deep humanity actually change the way we collectively react, and then going to the street and demand a change that is humane. I think that's a veracity, so we have that, and we still have that. I think we it is harder now because I think we deal with sort of like speed, right? Velocity of information, explosive effect, which is extreme effect, being emboldened, and also marketing, right? Type of politics, and speed. Speed is the enemy, right? So we forget on sort of like there is a range of emotion and affect that is beautiful, that has truth and spoke so loudly in the past, and we could still do that. I think it's a matter of how political figure and probably social movement groups might want to take on that. I think to admit that the importance of affect in genuine civil society movements.
If I can add something, also related to escapism versus conspiracy, I think the line between them can become blurred, specifically in social media, no matter how far individuals put effort to sort of distinguish between them. And the fact is that as a consequence of this application of certain words or conspiracies on social media, it becomes so hard for people to sort of separate them. In the context of law of jihad that I just mentioned, in fact, over the last few months, we see how these conspiracies are impacting on legislation. A new anti-conversion law that criminalizes religious conversion by marriage, recently enacted in several states in India, such as Uttar Pradesh, to tackle this law of jihad conspiracy theory. And under this legislation, anyone who basically found guilty of using marriage to convert their partner's religion will be prison up to 10 years, which started, as I said, is as literally there is no sort of evidence to back up this so-called conspiracy. But couples have been sort of stopped of getting married. Muslims are being sort of prisoned under this new legislation. So we see how this sort of social media, the impacts of it transfer to offline world and create such kind of consequences for people to deal with.
Thank you so much for that important point, Zainab. There are so many interesting questions in the chat. We will leave that here for people to read, the panelists and the audience. We don't have time for more questions today. I know everyone has a very busy schedule, but thank you all so much to the audience for joining us, and to these fantastic scholars for their work and contributions and insights today. Great to see you.
Yes, I just want to reiterate Megan's thanks to everyone, and I hope that folks can also join us at a second book launch involving other authors from this collection. I have put the registration link in the chat window. That's for April 20th at 11:30 a.m. to 1 p.m. We hope you can join us then as well. Thank you so much to everyone for joining us today. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.